Hi, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about an extremely important topic for a course on strategic management. And that topic is making strategic decisions. And by that, I refer to the selection of goals, strategic objectives, and strategy itself. So this is almost a pivot point in the course. So let's settle in and just get started on this very important topic. And with that, I'm going to try to bring up some slides here that will help us get through this. And there we are. So we're going to be talking about the methods for selecting standards for success, goals, and the approaches to pursuing them. And that's sort of what this slide says here. Now, earlier in the course, we broke down the 3 stages of strategic planning that occur after a mission has been selected. And of course, that doesn't happen very often, but missions do change. But we don't include mission selection in strategic planning because it's assumed to exist when we begin the planning process. So you may recall that planning process broke down into 3 stages of gathering evidence, making strategic decisions, and implementation. So now we're talking about making those strategic decisions. Now, back then, when we talked about the 3 stages, I defined each one of those stages as breaking into 2 parts: gathering evidence about the external environment and internal capabilities, making decisions with regard to goals and strategy, and implementation, deciding on projects, procedures, and activities to implement strategy, and then the process by which progress is monitored and replanning occurs. But here you can see that I'm sort of confessing now to having used a little sleight of hand earlier, because in fact, there are 3 steps or 3 stages in making strategic decisions. The first, as we said earlier, is to define success standards or goals. The second, we did not talk about before. Before we went right into selecting the approach to be taken in pursuing goals. Now the truth comes out. In order to develop that approach, we first have to define the intended results or outcomes or progress criteria for strategies as clusters of activity, goal-seeking activity. And so these are the intended objectives of strategy or strategic objectives. And usually there will be objectives for marketing strategy, objectives for operating strategy, objectives for research and development, and so on. And of course, financial objectives and administrative objectives. Once we have those strategic objectives developed, then it's time to form an approach consisting of activities that are instrumental to achieving those objectives and a rationale for selecting the approach to be taken rather than alternatives. That's the strategy. So let's pursue this approach further. Here's that original exhibit that we looked at in the past, and now we can appreciate it a little better. There are really 4 types of goals: financial goals, which may involve simply outperforming rivals, with regard to operating profit margin, return on investment, return on equity, and so forth. Another more advanced or more sophisticated approach to defining goals is to develop measures of economic value added by strategy. We won't get into that right now, but essentially measures of EVA are developed by defining the difference between rates of return on invested capital and the cost of invested capital. And the tricky part there is that the cost of invested capital isn't just the interest charged by lenders for debt, but rather the opportunity cost of shareholders in realizing a return on their equity. So it's a blend of those two that make up the cost of capital, or that at least the cost of capital that we use in calculating EVA. In any event, financial is the most common category of goal definition. We're all familiar with them. You would be surprised if I did not mention them. A second category of goals relates to competition, and these may be either quantitative or qualitative. If they're quantitative, they're usually expressed as market share. What portion of the market that we serve or the market segment that we serve do we serve? And are we satisfied with that share? Does it give us some measure of comfort that we're going to be able to influence the conditions of competition? Now, there are other forms of competitive goals, and they refer to market positioning, and they're qualitative. Sometimes they can be expressed quantitatively, but we're talking here about being a technology leader, being a quality leader, being the innovator in the industry in such a way that we're set apart due to our competences and capabilities to do things that set us apart in the eyes of buyers, the market, that our competitors aren't as capable of doing as we are. Now, what can happen, and I should have a little graph here, I think I've used it earlier in the course, but you can imagine that as a firm becomes more successful in its competitive positioning and its market share goes up, you can kind of imagine, I guess for you, I should do it this way. But as our market share goes up, so does return on investment or profitability. But at some point, we could reach a maximum. And if we want to get a higher market share, we might have to lower the price of our products or services, or we might have to add additional quality. We might have to add after the sale service. We might have to simply invest in more capacity and broader distribution, and all those things add to cost, the result of which is that our profit margin goes down, not up. For a while, as we go up, we get scale economy. The reason we're going up is that our product is superior to competitors' products. Perhaps customers will pay more for it, but at some point we reach a sweet spot. And beyond that, we have to compromise our financial results in order to gain a higher market share. Now, if our rate of return on invested capital already is above 20%, for instance, are we willing to see it drop from 22% to 19% perhaps in order to get a whole lot more volume? Probably we would do that. On the other hand, if the result of that decline is that we go from 10% to 2%, we might want to back up here and take the 10%. So there is a possibility, a likelihood of competition between financial and competitive goals. And it's a pitfall that strategic planners who are not well trained or experienced often encounter without even knowing it. The third then category of goals or success criteria is one that we don't think of all the time, and that is an acceptable level of risk. Some companies may just be starting out, or alternatively, they may have gotten into some kind of trouble. Could be that their product is no longer competitive. Could be technology is racing past them. Whatever the problem might be, the level of risk in the company has gone up. Perhaps as a result, the company has borrowed more money and its leverage ratio, the portion of invested capital represented by debt, has gone up. In that case, we're not really too concerned about outperforming our competitors' financial results, at least not for the time being, or even market share. What we're concerned about is surviving. And so it may be that we're at a point where what we're trying to do is achieve a more acceptable level of risk, or a more acceptable level of survivability, if you will. At the other extreme, level 4 on this chart, is the possibility that we've really succeeded, that our financial goals and competitive goals are being achieved, but the industry is growing old and mature. And although we've got a good share of it, growth potentials are pretty limited because the industry isn't growing very fast, or may even have started to decline. In that case, we've got an altogether different problem, and that is, how do we view long-term growth for this company? Because most companies, in order to survive, need to keep growing, and there are reasons for that which we don't want to get too deeply into here. But as you might imagine, people like to receive increases in salaries and wages. Governments tend to charge higher property taxes rather than lower property taxes, and so forth. So over time, costs tend to go up, and in order to cover those costs, our profits have to go up, and for those to go up, sales usually have to go up. So in the long term, the strategic planners need to think about long-term growth. But the time to do that isn't when we're trying to survive and deal with, achieve an acceptable level of growth, and it may not be when we're still fighting for acceptable financial results either. So there's obviously a priority here, and I call that the goals hierarchy. And the goals hierarchy is not an absolute construct, but rather it's a system of priorities. If we're seeking a more acceptable level of risk because our level of risk is too high, then that's where we have to focus our goals. And those goals might have to do with debt reduction, reduction in leverage, the proportion of capital represented by debt. It might involve achieving a more acceptable product through research and development, or some other engineering device. But until our risk is acceptable, that's where our priorities have to lie. Now, does that mean that we're not considering financial and competitive positions? Of course not, but there are priorities, and that's what this construct is meant to provide. After our risk is acceptable, then we move to superior financial results. In the long run, most textbooks will tell you that for a company to make it, in the long run, its financial results need to be superior. Otherwise, it'll fall by the wayside during a shakeout of some sort or another. So we need to have superior rates of return, and acceptable cash flows. And we need to have those before we put higher priority on market position, because what can happen is, as we noted earlier, that there's a conflict that can arise between market position goals and financial goals. And sometimes when we place early priorities on maximizing market position, we simply run out of money that is required to expand sales, to expand distribution, to operate in multiple markets, and to attain market positions, perhaps globally. Many companies have tried. Sometimes they succeed, but that is only if they can achieve a lot of assistance from venture capital firms and the like. So that's how Amazon did it. Amazon, for quite a while, negative net worth, and a lot of people, including me, way back in the old days, thought that Amazon wouldn't make it because there was no reason financially to believe that it would. But people who are smarter than I am realized that Amazon was the future, and continued to invest in it, even though financially it didn't make any sense. Strategically, technologically, it did make sense. Those people were right. I was not right. And I had a lot of company at not being right. Generally, it's better to put priorities on financial results and have a favorable financial condition before you start to invest capital in extended market positions. And then, as I said earlier, once you've achieved a favorable market position and your financial condition is good, you're in the position where you should be able to think about long-term growth. And if indeed your industry is mature, then you simply have to do that. But whether your industry is mature or not, strategies such as diversification, mergers, acquisitions into related industries, developing products that take you into related industries, those are the sort of things that management has to consider at that upper level. So this is the goals hierarchy, and it's a way for us to visualize in our mind's eye where the priorities for setting success criteria lie. Now, let's talk about another kind of success standard, and that's strategic objectives. I borrowed this artwork and made some minor modifications from an article that appeared way back when in the history of strategic planning, way back. It was the article was written by one of the founders of our profession, Michael Kami. Unless you're very old, that name won't mean anything to you at all. But in any event, Kami drew this diagram and said, first we have to identify what our goal is. And we're assuming that it's financial in this case, although it could be quantitative measures too, or physical measures as well. But then there's something that he called a momentum forecast. Today we call that a baseline forecast. So what Michael Kami called the momentum forecast, today we call the baseline. If we don't change our strategy, over time, technology, competition, change will result in our competitive position being reduced and weakened. And so if we don't change strategy, you can see that the momentum forecast indicates that eventually our performance will decline. So if we started out with sales of $100 million, just for instance, maybe in 10 years, and I imagine today it would be sooner than that, we'd have a 30% decline and our sales would end up at 70 if we don't change strategy. On the other hand, by looking at the growth of our market and our market share objectives, we decide that in order to have an acceptable market share 10 years from now, we have to have sales of $200 million, twice as great as today. Now, please understand the note at the bottom of this exhibit. The planning horizon, that is the period of time over which we set strategic objectives and form strategy, will differ depending on the industry. In some industries, 10 years is quite common for a planning horizon. Those are very asset-intensive industries with lots of capital invested and long time periods required to get a return on that capital investment. On the other hand, if we're talking about clothing, consumer products that turn over very quickly, where styles change rapidly, where capital investment isn't that large, then instead of 10 years, this diagram might be 2 years or 3. So planning horizons vary from very long to very large, very short. In any event, you can see that the strategic objective, the notation O sub S, in this case would be $130 million of sales, wouldn't it? The difference between 200 and 70. It's not 100. It's not the difference between 100 and 200, but the difference between the baseline forecast and the goal. And frankly, a little more than that, because we have to allow for human error. In my consulting experience, we always took a look at management's success in achieving its stated objectives. And if it was a little chancy, then that strategic objective of 130 might be increased to 150 or more. In any event, the strategic objective defines the value of new work that has to be done by achieving new products, new market positions, new technology, new. And the way we get those new things is by conducting projects and programs. And you can see that they're characterized on the right side of this diagram. So in this particular case, we probably would have found the most success-prone project or program that we could and laid its benefit on top of the momentum forecast. And then took a look and see how much more we had to go. And another program or project would be developed. Each one would have successive priority. The first one would have the highest priority because it would have the greatest benefit and so forth. And hopefully we would fill that gap in order to achieve the strategic objective. What happens if we can't come up with enough projects and programs to fill that gap? Now we've got a real problem. That's what I called the second gap. And sometimes that meant that we had to think in terms of mergers, acquisitions, alliances, and so forth. And sometimes even recognizing that the future of the enterprise is limited and we really need to find either a buyer or a merger partner. Usually we were able, management's not too keen on bailing out. So usually we were able to come up with the projects and programs that were required to fill that gap. And those projects and programs were the substance of the strategic plan. In a strategic plan, you've got about this much for goals and strategy, and this much for projects and programs. Okay, so what then does, once we've got, these projects and programs, or we think we want to have them, the question is exactly what approach is going to be taken. What do those activities consist of? And of course, they consisted at both the corporate level, where we might consider acquisitions, mergers, and so forth. Another discipline that we always consider in strategic planning is what is referred to as Porter's generic strategies of low cost, differentiation, and focus. In fact, those are strategic objectives. Low cost is the intended outcome of the activities that we're going to do to achieve lower cost, and they may be done through engineering, manufacturing methods, and so forth. So Porter's generic strategies are actually strategic objectives, and we'll take a look at those in just a minute. Other approaches to achieving strategic objectives may include balancing and changing the mix of products and businesses in the corporate portfolio or the business portfolio. Another possibility might be to integrate our business, existing business, with other businesses, perhaps those that sell our products or supply it with components, or alternatively, to integrate our business with other businesses just like ours. We'll talk about that as well. And finally, diversification, getting into new lines of business altogether. And then finally, contingent strategies, the idea that we'll have strategies predefined and preconceived so that if changes in our business conditions, in our markets, and in the industry and competition occur to the point where the rationale of our current business plan no longer is sustainable, we'll have alternative strategies preconceived, not necessarily fully developed, but ready to be developed so that we can move fast in times of crisis. Okay, so those strategic objectives that we talked about, Porter's least cost, differentiation, and focus. As I mentioned, these are really strategic objectives. They aren't the strategies themselves. I'm assuming that you've heard about Porter's least cost, differentiation, and focus strategies. So I won't burden you by going into them in too great a detail. Suffice it to say that least cost and differentiation are names that refer to strategies that are applied to an entire market or an entire industry. When we use the word focus, we can apply it to either low cost or differentiation, and we refer to those as focused low cost, focused differentiation strategies. Now, there are other types of strategies, including hybrid strategies that seek to achieve both low cost and differentiation. And we'll get into those in just a minute. Here, I'm going to let you look at three tables of information that I got from another old textbook on strategic management, goes way back. But these are simply characteristics of Porter's generic strategies. The low-cost leadership strategy, you can see what the target, the basis of advantage, the type of product line, and so forth, all the way down, marketing emphasis and the like. Here is a similar table for differentiation. So when you're doing your project in my course and you're trying to recommend the strategy of a company that you're studying, you might want to use these tables as a checklist. And here is another checklist for focused strategies. Again, I'm assuming that you've probably already had some sort of familiarity with these generic strategies, so I don't want to burden you with too much more. Suffice to say that we can think in terms of both value and cost when we're thinking about these strategies. So here's a very simple little diagram. And the blue section of this column represents the consumer surplus. Whenever we generate a product or service and ask a consumer to pay for it, the consumer, especially an industrial consumer, isn't going to pay our price unless the consumer feels that greater value will be realized than the price that that buyer pays. So we always have to take into account how our product or service benefits the people who buy that product or service. Where do they get added value? And if they can't get added value, that blue section of this column, they're probably not going to buy the product and we will suffer a loss. But if they do, then the pink portion of this column is the difference between the price and the cost, and it represents our profit. Here's a diagram that I borrowed from another textbook, the same one that the prior diagram came from, that was meant to compare Toyota and General Motors. And I've always been critical of this diagram for one reason, and it is that the price for Toyota products wasn't always higher than General Motors, although the folks who made this diagram wanted to indicate that because Toyota was putting more value, more quality into its products, it could actually charge a higher price than General Motors. And so even though the cost of doing so was higher, the consumer surplus was the same. Now, in fact, Toyota did not charge prices that much higher than General Motors. And so the customer got a lot higher consumer surplus than, or added value, than buyers of General Motors products did back then when this diagram was drawn. But you can see that because Toyota offered a higher quality product and could charge a higher price, and because Toyota was so efficient, famous for quality control methods such as Kanban and Kaizen, which it invented, Toyota's costs of production were lower than General Motors, yet it could offer more value and charge a higher price. So its profit margins were and still are much higher than General Motors and other auto producers. So don't try to equate this diagram to today's conditions. Things have changed a lot since this diagram was drawn. But you can see that if a company can add more value than its competitors, it may be able to charge a higher price. And if it's also efficient, like Toyota was, its costs might be lower, and it would thereby enjoy a higher profit margin. In fact, Alex Miller at the University of Tennessee unleashed an army of graduate students on the records of many companies. Don't hold me to this, but I think it was something like 300, maybe 400, but a lot of companies, and divided them into the type of generic strategy that they employed. Some of them, and you got to watch out the way you read the labels on the x-axis here. What I've copied Miller's diagram as he presented it. And so low means that the strategy had low differentiation and did not have high efficiency. It was low on that score as well. Low efficiency means high cost. So the bar on the far left is it represents companies whose costs are high and differentiation is low. So low differentiation, low efficiency, meaning high cost. So you gotta translate this this diagram. So the second bar over represented companies that were low on differentiation, but high on efficiency. That is to say, their costs were low. They had least cost strategies, and you can see their rate of return on investment was a lot higher. The third bar over represented companies that had high differentiation, but low cost strategies, that is to say, low efficiency. And they were better than the low, but they were not quite as good as the low cost strategy. Frankly, these two bars are so close together that if you did the research over, you might come up with an answer where they were about the same. As a matter of fact, today I would expect very possibly that differentiation would give you the higher result, but we never. The two provide competitive advantage. Now, what Porter did not give us in his original model, and what Miller found, was quite important. Miller found companies that had combinations of low cost and differentiation generic strategies. And this was new. This was something new and really important because, as you can see their rates of return on invested capital were higher than any of the others. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's very hard to get both low cost and differentiation. As a matter of fact, when Porter wrote originally, he wrote that it's almost impossible to get both. Since then, scholars, strategic management scholars, believe they have indeed found companies with the ability to develop both low cost and differentiation. And so today we talk about that as a hybrid strategy, one that combines both competitive advantages. If you can do it, life is good, but it's hard to do. And most firms seek either low cost or differentiation. If they have neither, Porter called them stuck in the middle. And the stuck in the middle companies are the ones on the far left here. And you can see that if they have neither low cost nor differentiation, their expected rates of return aren't very good at all. Not much higher than the cost of capital. All right, this takes us to the so-called portfolio approaches, where we take a look at the collection of products or businesses that companies have. And we'll take a look at some of those. The Boston Consulting Group has a very famous matrix strategy, and I think that's the very first one we'll be looking at. McKinsey and Company, a consulting firm, like Boston Consulting Group is also a consulting group, worked with General Electric to develop something called the multi-factor matrix. I'm not sure whether we will be looking at that in this lecture or not, but you might want to look it up. It's also a fairly widely used method. The directional policy matrix just takes a look not at what our current position compared to competitors is, but how well our capabilities and products are suited for future market conditions. And then finally, the life cycle, and we will certainly get into that. All right, so this is the BCG matrix. And it's one that I usually encourage my students to do, just because it does reveal a lot of information. So on the left, you can see that we have a BCG matrix that contrasts the businesses or products, market shares. You can see that on the x-axis, it doesn't go from left to right, it goes from right to left. So the high share is on the left. And it contrasts market share with the growth rate of the market that the product or the business is in. And so based on whether a product or a company is in a slow growing market with a high market share, or a slow growing market with a low market share, or a fast growing market with a low market share, or a fast growing market with a high market share, different consequences will occur and different strategic priorities will be required. Now, if a business or a product line has a high market share of a market that is mature and has started to slow down, that means that there isn't a lot of growth, but all the profit will be available as cash, because it doesn't have to be reinvested in expansion of capacity, product line development, other than to maintain the product and so forth. So that product, that business generates free cash flow. And as you can see in the diagram on the left, this business has a large product line that generates a lot of free cash flow. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any products that are in a fast growth market, perhaps because the market or the industry is just beginning to take off in market share fashion. And regrettably, I've visited lots of companies that look just like this one. And management is just as happy as it can be, because although it's not growing, it's making good profit, probably giving everybody bonuses, and has nice furniture in the executive suite. However, over time, its momentum forecast, its baseline forecast, wouldn't be very attractive. This company obviously needs to employ that capital for things other than furniture in the executive suite. It needs to invest in new businesses and new products. It's got one little product that has a large share of a fast-growing market, and that's probably what makes management so proud of its plum. But in fact, there's not enough there to really give it a future. Now, over time, what will happen is the star, if there was a business here in the venture category, if the business succeeded, its market share would grow and it would become a star. And that's what's happened here. And then eventually, over time, the star, as the market matures and the industry matures, would work its way down to a cash cow. And then eventually that market might go away. So this business that is represented by this BCG matrix is not in good shape, is it? Because it doesn't have sufficient opportunities to invest this surplus cash. And consequently, if I, as a consultant, saw this business and it was not my client, I would keep that in mind, because if I happen to have a client that had a lot of products that were growing, lots of new ventures, maybe even a star, with a high share of a growth market, but it was in the banks, it was borrowing a lot of money, and consequently its financial risk was high because its leverage was high. I might try to buy this business or merge with it so that I would have a more balanced portfolio of products. And so over on the right, we see a business, the portfolio of a business, just like the one that I described. You can see that it's got lots of new products in the hopper. They don't have large market shares because chances are these are new products for new markets, maybe even new industries. They've got one star that is in a fast growing market, but because the market's growing fast, even though that business has a high market share, all of the cash that is generated from profit will probably have to be put back into that very same business. It won't generate much free cash flow. As a matter of fact, it might be borrowing money from the bank as well. And we can see that the company here on the right has a couple little cash cows, but they're just not enough to feed these growing businesses up on the top. And like the other company, it's got a couple of dogs that shouldn't be there in the first place and will probably be divested. So if you were me as a consultant and the business on the right was your client and you knew about the business on the left, what do you think a good recommendation to the client would be? Well, you guessed right. We might suggest a merger or with the company on the left, or an acquisition. And if we put them together, we would have a nicely balanced portfolio of businesses. And as strategic planners, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for businesses that have free cash flow, businesses that are growing, and that give us an opportunity if we do the right thing. And we won't always succeed, but some of our ventures will eventually become stars. And if we have stars, that means that we're making good profit. So whether we're publicly owned or not, the investing public is going to like us because we're generating growing earnings from our star. We've got a nice solid financial condition thanks to our cash cow, and we've got an attractive future thanks to our ventures. That's dying and going to heaven. That's what we want as strategic planners. This takes us then to the life cycle, that thing that we just talked about. And chances are, if I were smart, I would discuss this first before I discuss the BCG matrix, because the BCG matrix, you will recall, really differs depending upon where in the life cycle these products are located. And in fact, this method was meant to exploit the characteristics of the industry or market life cycle. And again, at this point, I'm assuming that you've probably heard about an industry's life cycle. But the industry goes through 5 stages where it starts out, it begins as an embryo. May not be much competition there because at the very outset, there may only be one company, right? It's probably not very efficient because it hasn't learned much about how to make its product or serve its customers. But if it succeeds at the outset, then there will be a period of growth. And lots of things happen then. Among other things, when the industry is growing, new companies do come into the industry because they see that growth and they witness the success of the embryonic company that started it, which presents some real challenges to the embryonic company. Eventually, the industry's growth begins to slow down and a sort of a shakeout occurs. Now, I confess, I drew this diagram and I could have done a better job. I should have, this thing is still growing too fast here in the shakeout stage, and it should be flattening out about like this. But at the shakeout stage, there's not going to be enough growth to support businesses that aren't well conceived and well operated when they got started down in the growth stage. And they'll fall away or they'll be acquired. But eventually there will be a stage of maturity, and that mature stage may last a very long time. You're still using soap, aren't you? Ladies, are you still using cosmetics? We're all still wearing clothing. So some some industries just get into the mature stage and stay there. Others, like the buggy whip, you know, they decline. So for some industries, they go away as new industries arise to take their place, and a second life cycle stage occurs. That creates a situation where we have to jump curves and essentially start on a new curve like this up here when we see that the shakeout stage is occurring and we expect a decline to occur. We'll try to get into a new industry that is just beginning again. But that is subject for more advanced strategic planning and strategic management. So those are the life cycle stages. And here we can just sort of recap them. Embryonic starts out with very few, with just one firm and a very few. They try to build their market share, figure out what life is all about. And growth, the stronger firms begin to make larger capital investments to sustain their positions and capitalize on growing demand for this products. Other companies that don't have quite the same strength may try to focus in on one segment of the market, one particular niche in the industry. And groups of companies may form in an industry. By way of example, pharmaceuticals. We have generic drugs. We have drug companies that focus on research and development. We have organic drugs now as opposed to chemical drugs, and we have corporations that combine these things. So over time, as industries grow, groups of companies that have similar characteristics may form and take up positions within the industry. And then, as we said, eventually the industry doesn't grow quite as fast. The growth rate slows down. Strong firms can maximize their share. They get more efficient. They do a low cost or differentiation strategy. Weaker firms either focus more tightly on their market segments or perhaps withdraw, or they might merge or sell out to larger companies. And finally, in mature, we're left with at the growth stage, we've got a lot more companies. In the shakeout, Several companies get weeded out, and in the mature stage, we've got fewer companies again. And their intent is to hold their positions, whether it's as an industry leader or a specialist in a market niche. That's when the hybrid strategy, when both low cost and differentiation strategies are likely to appear. But it's at that mature stage, as we said when we looked at the BCG matrix, that we don't have to reinvest a lot of our profit. And profitability is available, and so is cash flow. It's at the mature stage that companies very often make a lot of money, on most of the money in their lives. And then the little pitfall. You can't get too comfortable with your position, because if you reach maturity and don't take a look at that longer term potential that we talked about earlier, you could end up being a Kodak, a Sears Roebuck, or a Kmart. And then finally, the decline. As I indicated earlier, many industries don't decline. But if decline occurs, then leaders may acquire followers, the weaker companies, and actually grow for a while, even though the total industry volume is declining. It may be that some of the specialists in the industry, or even leaders, identify segments of the market that are still profitable, and instead of participating in all segments, sort of narrow down their focus on those segments that remain profitable. But eventually, if an industry declines, you got to come to grips with the fact that it might not be here anymore. Now, let's just take a look at another factor here. First of all, my sloppy life cycle curve, where we see the industry going through growth. As this happens, companies that ride this curve gain experience. And with that experience comes efficiency and lower cost. And so we see this inverse curve. Now, I drew this one a little better. But you can see that it's the growth curve upside down. And what we see is that over the life cycle, costs of firms tend to come down. So the firm that started first, if it does the right thing, will stay ahead of other companies and achieve lower costs than those that come in later. Unless, of course, those that come in later have more advanced technology. However, once we get to the growth stage, what's going to happen is that everybody in the industry is now down here in the mature stage, and essentially nearly all competitive advantages have been competed away. I got that phrase from one of my heroes, Jay Barney, who is one of the fathers of the resource-based view of competitive advantage. I'm sorry, I'm an old man, and every once in a while it's hard to dredge those words up from my vocabulary. Anyway, Barney's phrase was competitive advantages get competed away. I love that phrase. So what's going on down here and all the way down this curve is that engineers in the leader's firm are dissatisfied with their pay. They want to get paid more. And lo and behold, there's somebody that just came into the industry up here, and they want to know how that firm that got down here on the cost curve got there. And so they hire away engineers from the leader and other firms, or They develop, they hire scientists and engineers with new technology. They may get in touch with the engineers and construction firms and the suppliers of machinery and equipment that supplied the manufacturing operations of the leader, and tell them they're interested in buying that same kind of equipment. And if you're a salesperson, you say, oh boy, here I come. By the way, we've got a new improved version of that product. Would you like to buy it? And of course they say, the customer, the competitor says, of course we would. And as a result, they get machinery and equipment that's even more efficient than the first mover, unless the first mover has already gotten that supplier and replaced its original equipment. And so it goes until all the firms in the industry have pretty much the same talent, pretty much the same production and manufacturing and distribution methods, and all competitive advantages have been competed away. So at this point, can you be a least cost competitor? And the answer is probably not. Now, there's one, and that's why differentiation, in my view, is the more resilient competitive advantage, because eventually least cost competitive advantages will be competed away. There is one possible way to improve on this curve, and that is right down here at the very end. What tends to happen? And what happens in the mature phase is that acquisitions and mergers occur. And so if we're right down at the end of the experience curve, we might be up here at the beginning of the cost curve, and we acquire another company. We merge with another company. At that point, we need only one president, only one treasurer, only one accounting department, only one data processing department, only one sales force, perhaps. And so lots of costs will come out of the new combined corporation, and the costs will come down. And with larger volume, scale economy and efficiencies may occur. And so it's very possible that there is one further way to get your costs down when your industry matures, and that is to work your way down economies of scale by becoming larger. Now, as the industry moves into the decline phase, this becomes very difficult, doesn't it? But to the extent that it can be done during the mature phase, this is a possibility to improve cost even further. All right, let me get a little drink here. Again, I'm going to assume that you've seen a value chain before. I'm going to show you a diagram of one, but I sure hope that you've seen a value chain before. It's a concept created by Michael Porter, another of my heroes. He's the guy who gave us low cost and differentiation, remember? Very productive strategic thinker. Rather interesting that he wasn't trained as a strategist. He was trained in economics at Penn State. Huh. There must be a relationship between economics and strategy. Oh, well, that's for another time. The value chain can exist for a company, and we'll take a look at that, or an industry. As a matter of fact, I'll do it right now. I'll switch here. So a value chain for an industry, in this case, the auto industry, goes through several stages, from raw material and components, perhaps to subassembly. So in the auto industry, steel, tires, batteries, electronics, and so forth, eventually get made into components. The auto industry itself doesn't make a lot of sub-assemblies. It does make some, but in my consulting career, I worked with a company that made doors for Ford. That's it, doors. And inside that door, there was a lot of machinery that had to be assembled before that door with the window and the device that raises it up and down. There's a little X type machine inside. And when the electric motor turns, the cross bars go up or down, and that raises the window up or down. Anyway, the the auto industry has lots of subassembly suppliers, and then eventually those subassemblies get to the auto producers, and they put all these subassemblies and components together into a finished car. But the industry's not done yet, is it? Because it consists of dealers who take these cars and sell them to you and me. Not only that, but in addition to their service departments, there are businesses that deal in auto service and repair. So it's a rather large, complicated industry. What's interesting is that although this is the industry's value chain when we look at it vertically, if we look horizontally, what might we find? Chevrolet, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, now called, I can't remember the French company that acquired Chrysler. Shame on me. Tesla, and all the companies, Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, So there are a whole lot of companies here in the auto industry. But more importantly, each one of these industries has its own value chain. So the steel industry, if we were to look at it alone, would have a vertical industry just like this, with suppliers of machinery to mine ore, to refine it, to make blast furnaces, to make the machinery inside steel mills, to roll and cast steel, and so forth. So the steel industry has its own value chain, vertically as well as horizontally. So the value chain is far from the simple concept that it appears to be when we look at something like this. Let me go back to where we left off for a minute. So we can have a value chain of a company or of an industry. We can integrate by acquiring companies, other companies. And if we do it vertically, that means that we're acquiring companies that either supply our company or sell our products. That's doing a vertical acquisition or a vertical merger. And we could acquire all of we could acquire enough business, enough of our suppliers, so that we don't need to buy anything more at all. We could supply all of our own raw material requirements. That would be full integration. Usually the best move is to take advantage of market conditions when suppliers aren't doing too well, and they'll sell their product at a low price. So tapered vertical integration refers to partial integration, where we acquire businesses or resources to supply our own needs, but not 100%, because we want to take advantage of the ability of some of our suppliers to supply our needs at a low price. But when when our industry's market is booming and our suppliers come to us and demand a higher price, we can hold out and say, look, if you're going to charge a high price like this, we'll just supply ourselves. And the salespeople very often will say, well, you know, we can discuss this and we'll get a little better price. Anyway, that's tapered as opposed to full vertical integration. And you can see the benefits here. If we can do this well, it'll make it difficult for other companies to come into the industry because they won't have all those abilities. It may be that we'll be able to make some improvements in those suppliers or distributors so that we can do things that our competitors can't see us doing with specialized assets, which will enable us to differentiate. We can obviously make sure that only the best ingredients are going into our product, and we can make sure that we've got the raw materials or sub-assemblies when we need them. We don't have to wait for our suppliers to get around to delivering. There are lots of problems with vertical integration. We might end up buying a supplier who has one technology, and shortly thereafter, a better technology comes along. I saw that happen with a company that bought a business that made castings, and it did it by pouring metal into a mold. Not long afterward, and a problem with that was that when the hot metal poured into the mold, there were bubbles. And if those bubbles froze inside the casting had to be discarded because it was a safety hazard. Later on, not very much later at all, another company devised a vacuum casting method. And the raw material, the hot metal, was poured into a sort of a siphon, but it was pulled in by a vacuum, and that vacuum avoided the creation of bubbles, and every casting was perfectly solid. My client bought the bubble method and eventually had to scrap it and had to write off a large investment in the process. So the technological change is a big problem. It may be that because you are vertically integrated, you've got lots of overhead costs, and the bureaucratic costs of integrating all the stages in the vertical value chain are just too difficult, too costly. So to do vertical integration, you really have to know what you're doing. And nevertheless, one of the companies that integrates vertically is Apple, which writes its own software, makes its own products, it uses captive suppliers to do that, has its own distribution and so forth. So the vertical integration certainly is a strategic possibility in some industries for some companies. So here's the classic value chain, and that really should have been up here. I'm going to move it up now. But this is Porter's famous value chain. And I hope you can appreciate that these stages are oversimplified, that the stages of a value chain in a complex industry and a complex corporation could be much more intricate. For instance, I divided production into sub-assembly and assembly. And believe me, those are separate stages in the auto industry. Marketing and sales in the auto industry also can be divided. Nevertheless, the reason we think in terms of a value chain is we often find out that it's at one stage or another where we're able to achieve differentiation or tremendous efficiency. and where we add the greatest value. Value for whom? Our company? No, for the customer. All right, and it's because we get better, more differentiated at one stage or another. And in the case of electronic products, companies that make cell phones, they discovered that it's the research and development where the value is really added, not the manufacturing. And so cell phone companies, when they read Porter's article and thought about it, outsourced the production of their products to other companies because no value was added. So Porter's value chain really enlightened us as to how to think about the creation of value in our own processes. And of course, there's a difference to be made between activities that support all of these direct primary activities, and they're called support activities, and I won't bore you with those. So, okay, we talked about the vertical integration. So now what about horizontal? And horizontal integration simply means that we're going to buy other companies at the same level in the industry value chain that our company is located in. And by doing that, we may get scale economy, which will enable us to lower cost. We may be able to offer complementary products that are made by the companies in our industry that we acquire. This happens in the finance industry by way of example. So if a bank doesn't have oh boy, there I go. A department a trust department, there we go. It may acquire a bank that has a strong trust department in order to gather up clients which are really trusts, that is, collections of assets on behalf of beneficiaries. That can be very lucrative. Maybe the bank doesn't have a subsidiary that does stock brokerage, but it might decide to do that. So in any event, service companies as well as manufacturing companies will often integrate within their same industry in order to collect bundles of related products. And then if the company that was a stock brokerage has a lot of clients, gets acquired by a banking company, the banking company is going to offer banking services to the stock brokerage clients, and the stock brokerage is going to offer service to the banking clients. So that's cross-selling. As this process goes on over time, needless to say, there are fewer remaining companies, and so rivalry may go down, and therefore the industry's profit may go up. If that gets to be too exaggerated, if too much of that goes on, the government tends to get involved, and we have antitrust suits. But to the extent that companies grow through mergers and acquisitions, which is how horizontal integration takes place, then by being larger, they're able to deal more forcefully with their suppliers as well as their distributors. Again, there are problems. Mergers and acquisitions tend to be widely publicized, especially when they're successful. What you don't hear about are the mergers and acquisitions that are not successful. They don't get publicized as much. But as it turns out, the success record of acquisitions is only about a third. So about a third are successful, a third are abject failures, a little more than a third, and a third make no difference financially You get a merger or an acquisition, but the financial results of the two elements in the merger or acquisition are not improved very much. And as I say, in a third of the cases, they may go the wrong way. So it's tough to do good acquisitions and mergers. I'm proud of my record as an acquisition advisor. About the middle of my career, I had done with my firm 22 acquisitions. We had 20 outright successes, one that became a success later, but we had to call it a borderline because it wasn't a success when we did this measure. Later on, it was a success. And we had one flop, one terrible, awful acquisition. But compared to that 30% failure rate, we were eager to tell people about our track record because we really took the time to architect, to figure out exactly why strategically a combination of businesses worked or did not work. And that's what's required. One of the reasons that things don't work out well is that you've got two perfectly good companies with very different cultures, and they come together, and it's like trying to mix oil and water. They don't mix, and that's the end of that. So that's horizontal integration as opposed to vertical integration. And I should have rearranged the sequence of these slides. I'm going to do that now so that I don't get into this problem again. There we are. I think that's got it right. Okay, on to a different approach to devising the portfolio of products or businesses. And I want you to take particular note of this method. So if this has gone on a long time, if you want to turn off the computer or put this on hold and go to the bathroom, drink some coffee, this is a good time to do it. Actually, we won't go too much more in this lecture, but I believe that this method of devising a business portfolio is mentioned in a test, I believe test number 2 in my course on strategic management. So this is one you really want to pay attention to. In any event, it was developed by a Russian guy named Igor Antsov. Again, Antsov was not trained as a strategist. He was a physicist who, among other things, was captured after the Second World War because the Americans wanted to have his talents for themselves rather than the Russians. And so Antsov came to the United States and eventually found himself fascinated by computers and the flow charts, the way you design systems. And using flow charts and system design, he came up with a lot of concepts for strategic planning, which are still used today. And he is, again, one of the founders of modern strategic planning. In any event, Antsov gave us a very simple diagram, a very simple matrix, which you should use in doing your project in the strategic management course to identify exactly what the approach to growth of your company has been or perhaps should be. So Antsov reasoned quite logically that products or services or businesses within a corporation are either existing or they could be new. You could come up with new ones. And the markets that you serve are either served now, or in order to grow, you're going to enter new markets. So existing products or new products to grow. Sorry, let me start over. Existing products or new products in order to grow. Existing markets or entry into new markets in order to grow. Now, we can grow in existing markets with existing products. And that's what managers go to work to do every day. That's what the present business strategy is all about. What the implementation of the present business strategy is all about. Market penetration, gaining market share, advertising, promotion, expanding the sales force, more efficient delivery, more efficient operations to reduce cost and maximize profit and also be more price competitive. That's the way business is done day in and day out. However, it may be that we've pretty well tapped out our opportunities for market penetration. So what's the new? What can we do next? One possibility is that we could take these products that we make now and offer them in new markets. And so we go to other regions of our existing country or other countries. And this is basically the approach we take to international expansion. Now we got to be careful, right? Because it may be that the products that we offer in our country aren't necessarily attractive in other countries. But we'll hold that for a little bit later in the discussion. But quite reasonably, we can take our existing products and offer them in new markets. And that's one way to grow. And so you should be asking yourself, how has the company we're studying grown through market development? How could it grow through market development? Now, another way to grow is to develop new products for our existing markets. And that's what we were talking about just a few minutes ago when we talked about banks getting into trust services or securities and so forth. Manufacturing companies develop new products for the existing markets. Automotive companies are doing that all the time, aren't they? So product development is a very sexy way to grow. It takes engineering, right? It's a completely different approach than market development. Market development is a marketing approach. Product development is about engineering, research and development, and so forth, in order to develop an altogether new product, like Tesla. Now, what happens if we get to the other country and we find out that they don't like our product the way it is, that the way they make and buy this product is different? And so we're going to make the same kind of clothing or machinery that we're making now, but we're going to make it bigger or smaller or more flexible, but it's going to be a different product for a different market. That's what we call product proliferation. And product proliferation can even become diversification, where we make an altogether new product for a new market. And so we see this very often when companies expand their product lines. So if we think about John Deere, Deere makes agricultural machinery with great big heavy diesel engines, but it also makes construction machinery. And it also makes logging machinery. So these are new products for different markets, but they're related to each other. And so Deere's very good at it, and John Deere has large shares of each of those markets. it developed new products for new markets, through diversification, related diversification. And we'll get back into this in a couple of minutes. Here's the next approach. You can now relax. This one's not on the test, but it's worth knowing that in order, and this one was developed by a guy named C.K. Prahalad and a partner whose name I cannot remember. In any event, how will we develop new capabilities? And you can see that it looks very similar to Ansough's matrix. But now we're talking about industry rather than market. Existing industry or new industry? Existing competence or new competence? And here the positions have been replaced, but filling in the blanks, using existing competences to compete in our existing industry. Again, this is what we do every day. We try to take our manufacturing, our service, our control, our internal processes, and get better and better at them. On the other hand, it may be that in order to compete in this industry, we have to develop entirely new competences. And so Toyota developed the Prius, the hybrid car, part electric, part internal combustion engine. Today, this is where the action is in the auto industry, right? Trying to come up with electric cars and self-driving cars. So Premier Plus 10 is what Prahalad and Gary Hamel, it was Gary Hamel and C.K. Prahalad were the authors of this matrix. And what they called this strategy is Premier Plus 10, thinking that it might take 10 years to develop new products or new capabilities to serve a future industry, the way the industry would be postured and positioned a decade from now. Now they called it Premier Plus 10, but for our industry, it might be plus 5 or 3 or 20. And I was reading recently about quantum computers. Quantum computer may not be available for another decade. But when it is, the whole world's going to change. So, Premier Plus 10, Premier Plus 15, Premier Plus 20 could be. So don't be misled by that number 10. Now, the white spaces, taking our existing competences and moving into another industry. And that's exactly what Deere did, because it took its diesel engine competences and lots of its manufacturing competences and really improved on construction machinery. It still isn't the size of a Caterpillar, though, so you could argue with me about that. But essentially, we're taking taking our existing capabilities and using them either to introduce new products and services into a new industry, or perhaps modifying how that industry does business. And then there's the mega opportunity. These are very rare, where we develop new competences for altogether new industries. And here I sometimes think about the high-tech medicine, the ability of Monsanto to develop hybrid seeds for the agricultural industry. Originally, Monsanto made agricultural chemicals, not seed. So mega opportunities are where you're going to develop an entirely maybe new industry with capabilities that you're able to develop because they're somehow related to and benefit from the capabilities that you already have. Let me ask you a question. On this matrix, where do you find the lowest level of risk? I hope you said fill in the blanks, existing capabilities with existing in the existing industry. Where is the risk the highest? Obviously, mega opportunities, and they're moderate in between with the other two. Where is the potential of a strategy that uses fill in the blanks versus mega opportunities the highest? We know where the risk is the highest. The risk is the highest with mega opportunities, very low with fill in the blanks. But where is the potential return on investment? It's highest with mega opportunities, isn't it? So as the old saying goes, with risk comes reward. And by the way, that's the same here. When we're talking about market penetration, risk isn't as high. When we're talking about product proliferation and diversification, risk is higher, but the potential return is also higher. Okay, this now takes us to diversification. We've got this and 2 more slides. So diversification, quite simply, is going beyond the industry that we're already in. Risk is higher, but if we're wise and we can adapt a multi-business model that takes advantage of relationships between our current competences and our current products and the industries where we want to expand, then it may be that we can manage that risk and enjoy a higher rate of return. So generally speaking, and I'll show you a diagram in just a minute, where generally speaking, to the extent that we can capitalize on our existing capabilities and our existing industry presence and our existing market knowledge, we're going to get better results than if we go far afield. Okay, we can do this through acquisitions. We can buy another company. We can do it through internal ventures. We can do it through mergers and acquisitions. We can do it through joint ventures and strategic alliances. And indeed, we may, if we get over our heads and we diversify too far, if we try to go down here into product proliferation and it doesn't work out well because we've tried to get into a market that we don't understand, or develop a new product that doesn't work out and it isn't accepted, we may have to restructure the business. We may have to turn the business around, clean up our act, fix errors, discontinue unsuccessful products, turn the business around. If that doesn't work, we may have to go into reorganization through bankruptcy proceedings, in which case our shareholders will be treated very poorly. They may get nothing. And the companies that have loaned us money and have security interests, that is to say, we are obliged to serve their interests before shareholders and even our creditors, they may end up being the new stockholders. Bankruptcies are tough to do and they're hard to do successfully. And so many bankruptcies, sadly, turn into liquidation. Chapter 7 of the Bankruptcy Code, which calls for the discontinuing the business, selling the assets, and providing proceeds to creditors, first secured creditors, and secondly, unsecured creditors. And employees have a partially preferred position in that order of priorities, but not a perfect priority. There are limits on employees' protections. So that's restructuring, and it's not a pretty thing to get into. Better to do one of these other things. Now, we've talked about acquisitions and mergers already, but what we have not talked about is developing products internally. So just a quick comment about that. And here, maybe I'll see if I can pick up a little graphic device. I hope it works. Okay. So in this case, if we do internal new ventures, as opposed to alliances or acquisitions, we will have greater control, won't we? As it turns out, financial results of alliances are better than acquisitions, and we said that acquisitions are successful only a third of the time. So from the standpoint of risk, oops. I hope I can do this. Well, I'm making a mess of it. I'd better give up on this. Of course, what I can do is just do it all over again. So I'll go get another arrow and make it go this way. Okay. So in this case, what we find out is that the potential profitability, I'm sorry, I've got the same arrow. So in this case, with this arrow, we're pointing out that control is highest with internal new ventures and lowest with alliances because we have partners. And we have control of acquisitions after we acquire the company, but for a while we don't have control because, again, we have culture clashes and we don't quite know what the new business is all about. Now, what I've tried to indicate before, and I'll take one last stab at it here, is that profitability goes this way. Strategic alliances, research shows, are more profitable than internal new ventures by far. Internal new ventures have a very bad track record because they tend not to be completed. They get started and then an emergency arises and they get put on the shelf and they may never be completed. Acquisitions can be profitable, but as you know, they have a mixed record. Strategic alliances done right capitalize on the strengths of each partner in the alliance. And today, we're faced with a very complex environment where it's almost impossible for every company to have all the right stuff as technology, industry conditions, market conditions, political conditions all change. In order to have all the right resources and capabilities to enter new markets and new industries successfully, it's usually necessary to combine the capabilities and resources of partners. Not always, but very often. And when we do this, if we have two partners that have the right stuff, the best stuff, when they put their capabilities together, the joint venture, the new company that they form, is hard to beat, unless they beat themselves because the partners don't get along and can't compromise and respect one another. If they do, and they have a successful joint venture, you know what they'll do? They'll do it again because now they'll feel confident. And so they'll go into another joint venture. And again, if it works out well, they begin to get real confident in one another. They become good partners. And at that point, partners have the habit of going into ventures, joint ventures, with a lot of confidence and a lot of gusto, not being afraid that the other one's going to steal its secrets. Nevertheless, that is a risk that partners will steal each other's each other's talents, each other's secrets. I'm sorry, I said risks. They'll steal each other's secrets and then go off with those secret capabilities and start independent businesses, which may even compete with a joint venture. That's a risk that you have to bear in mind when you're looking at strategic alliances and joint ventures. But all things considered, strategic alliances and joint ventures very often are the smart move, as long as you can get used to the fact that you're not going to have absolute control. You've got a partner, and the partner has interests just like you do. So here's the last slide, and it's in some sense, some ways, it's at least as important as the others. Research was first done by a guy named Richard Rumelt. And he's moved from Harvard to UCLA. I think he did this research when he was at UCLA, but I'm not sure. But he wanted to find out just what characteristics of acquisitions were conducive to the best results. His results were a lot more complicated than this diagram represents. He found different levels of relatedness between companies that were acquired, between the acquirer and the acquiree. But what I've got on this diagram is the big surprise that Rumelt gave us, and he'll be famous for this. First of all, no surprise. He found out that when businesses that have nothing in common are combined under the same corporate umbrella, when acquisitions of unrelated businesses occur, their financial results tend to be pretty terrible. The big surprise was the reverse did not hold, because it was expected that if two companies had the same competences and the same characteristics, they would make perfect bed partners, perfect marriage partners. They would fit together very nicely. And although they did, their results were the second worst. They were better than the unrelated diversification, but not as good as combinations of businesses that had things in common, but not perfectly. That there was a difference, that some had perhaps marketing skills that the other didn't have, that the other one had manufacturing skills that the first one didn't have, or research, or positions in foreign markets, and so forth. In short, to the extent that merger or acquisition partners could share resources and competences to each other's benefit, you get this funny phrase that people sometimes use: 2 + 2 = 5. Okay, so this partner benefits from the other partner's marketing competences, which are superior. This partner benefits from this partner's manufacturing and research and development competences, which are superior, and so forth. So to the extent that there's sharing of resources and competences, merger and acquisition partners generate superior financial returns. And you can see that they have to be, do you notice the arrow here in the middle? It's really not in the middle, is it? It's not over, I was going to move it, but I better not try. But it's not in the middle. Okay, it's over here toward the close to each other side. And if I had done this right, I might have even moved it a little further to the left. There has to be relationship here. The two partners have to be able to benefit from each other's competences and resources. But if they do, 2 and 2 equals 5. So with that, I'm sure that you must be tired of listening to me and looking at my slides. We don't have enough time in class to go over the scope of strategic decisions like we did in this video lecture. So I hope that you were smart enough to stop it now and then, go to the bathroom, take a break, whatever. And I am sorry that it took us so long. But we've covered strategic decisions pretty well in this video. And I hope that you will be able to make use of it even after you leave your studies and get into industry, because this stuff is real important. So I'll let you go now. That is, I will, if I can figure out how to stop this video, but I'll wish you a good study and hope to see you again real soon. Bye.